Did Attorney General Pam Bondi just let top officials like Howard Lutnick off the hook for their ties to Jeffrey Epstein? Or did Representative Becca Balint just expose a deeply broken justice system on live television? Representative Becca Balint just confronted Attorney General Pam Bondi over top government officials, including Howard Lutnick, and their documented ties to Jeffrey Epstein's network, revealing what happens when the justice system is pushed to its absolute breaking point. Back in 2008, Jeffrey Epstein was officially convicted as a predator. Yet, in 2012, a man who would eventually rise to the position of Secretary of Commerce took a trip to his infamous private island. Fast forward several years, and this same individual was elevated to one of the most powerful economic roles within the United States government. Today, the sitting Attorney General is completely unable to confirm whether anyone within her department even bothered to question him regarding these associations. We are not witnessing a mere memory lapse. Rather, we are watching a catastrophic collapse of government oversight unfolding in real time. What you are about to examine is not a standard congressional hearing, a polite political debate, or a simple misunderstanding. Instead, it is a high-stakes stress test of our justice system, and under intense pressure, the foundations of that system simply gave way. The very second Representative Becca Balint started firing off direct, yes or no questions, the illusion of accountability began to splinter. This fracture did not happen subtly or slowly. It happened visibly with every single line, every evasive answer, and every stubborn refusal. Sitting squarely at the epicenter of this institutional breakdown was Attorney General Pam Bondi. The inquiry sounded incredibly straightforward because, at its core, it was. Did the Department of Justice interrogate senior government officials about their verified and documented links to Epstein, yes or no? This was not based on some wild theory, a fleeting rumor, or dramatic political theater. It was grounded in documented names, precise dates, and concrete travel logs formally entered into the congressional record. Yet, instead of receiving a clear answer, the room witnessed something completely different. There was a noticeable shift in tone, a sudden change in physical posture, and most critically, a blatant pivot away from the actual question. Balint explicitly stated that she was not asking trick questions. That specific phrase carries massive weight because, in a setting explicitly designed for sworn congressional testimony, labeling a factual question as a trick is nothing more than an escape hatch used to dodge the truth. Pam Bondi refused to say yes, and she refused to say no. Instead, she proclaimed that she was stunned. Being stunned is a feeling, not an answer. It is a visceral reaction, the exact kind of reaction people display when the underlying facts are far too dangerous to confront head-on. If you watch the sequence of events closely, you will see exactly where this proceeding transforms from a standard procedural event into a glaring diagnostic of a failing system. A specific name is brought into the light: Howard Lutnick. His prominent position is clearly established: Secretary of Commerce. The dark connection is unequivocally referenced. Ties to the Epstein network, thoroughly documented within completely unredacted investigative files. Following this setup comes the pivotal question that should have logically concluded the exchange with a simple one-word response of yes or no. But the exchange does not conclude. Instead, Pam Bondi strategically redirects the conversation toward a much safer, rehearsed talking point, stating that Lutnick has addressed those ties himself. While that sentence might sound resolute, it is functionally hollow because relying on self-reporting is the absolute antithesis of an investigation. In the realm of serious institutional audits, permitting the subject of intense scrutiny to dictate their own defense narrative does not qualify as due diligence. It is a blatant abdication of duty. This is precisely the moment where the entire structure of the defense begins to cave under its own immense weight. Representative Balint does not back down after the first attempt. She asks again, and then again, systematically tightening the analytical frame with every repetition. Her question was not whether Howard Lutnick had spoken to the media, nor whether he had published a carefully crafted PR statement denying the allegations. The true question was whether the Department of Justice, the specific federal entity tasked with enforcing the law, had looked Lutnick in the eye and asked him directly about those disturbing ties. Even with that precise framing, an answer remains entirely absent. As a result, the silence in the room begins to physically accumulate, and in an investigative context, silence is never a neutral factor. Silence morphs into raw data. Every single non-answer serves as a crucial data point, and every linguistic deflection forms a distinct pattern. Investigators rely on these exact types of patterns to construct their cases. When three distinct, high-ranking officials are explicitly named and absolutely none of them can be positively confirmed to have faced DOJ questioning, the crisis shifts from an individual failing to a systemic rot. The names listed are not mere abstractions. They represent monumental nodes of federal power. Howard Lutnick serving as Secretary of Commerce, John Phelan acting as Secretary of the Navy, and Stephen Feinberg holding the position of Deputy Secretary of Defense. These men are not peripheral background characters. They are central pillars in the architecture of the United States federal authority. According to the unredacted files prominently cited during this explosive hearing, every single one of these individuals possesses documented connections to Epstein. We are not talking about speculative rumors or incredibly distant, indirect associations, but rather concrete entries in official records that have now been forcefully dragged into the unforgiving light of the public domain. And still, when pressed on whether the Justice Department has formally engaged with these powerful men regarding those exact ties, Pam Bondi offers absolutely zero confirmation. She provides no clear refusal, no outright denial, just an echoing absence of information. In this incredibly high-stakes environment, that deliberate absence serves as the most profoundly revealing answer imaginable. Now, we must evaluate the devastating contrast that Representative Balint expertly introduces, as this is the exact juncture where the heavy moral weight of the entire ordeal begins to drastically escalate. Relying on the Department of Justice's very own statistical data, Balint highlights a chilling reality. A child is subjected to sexual abuse in the United States every 9 minutes. That horrific statistic is not some abstract mathematical concept. It is a stark, operational reality that dictates ultimate urgency. It is the very metric that should define federal priority and fundamentally justify why the entire justice system was constructed in the first place. Yet, when directly confronted with glaring evidence of a multi-decade criminal network that heavily intertwined with some of the wealthiest and most influential figures on the planet, the formidable justice system suddenly hesitates. This hesitation does not occur because the underlying evidence is muddy or unclear, but rather because the ensuing implications are far too crystal clear for comfort. This dynamic represents the gaping contradiction situated at the very beating heart of the hearing. On one hand, there is an incredibly vocal, publicly declared commitment to pursuing justice, constantly regurgitated in press briefings and heavily reinforced in official policy language. On the other hand, there exists a stubborn, unyielding refusal to engage with highly specific, well-documented cases that happen to involve powerful men who currently occupy the highest echelons of government. The vast chasm separating these two opposing realities is not merely a theoretical construct. It is a measurable, palpable void, defined by the deafening silence that fully consumes the committee room. At one highly specific moment, the building tension reaches such a visible crescendo that Pam Bondi completely abandons her previous tactics and shifts her strategy entirely. Instead of mustering an answer to the fundamental question, she aggressively challenges the foundational premise of the inquiry itself, immediately labeling Balint's line of questioning as entirely inappropriate. Bondi dramatically declares that the line of inquiry is pathetic. That specific choice of vocabulary is not an accidental slip of the tongue. When a prominent figure is entirely incapable of dismantling the solid evidence placed before them, their very next tactical maneuver is almost always to fiercely discredit the underlying procedural mechanism that brought that evidence to light. However, deploying that aggressive strategy comes with a severe institutional cost. It instantly reframes the entirety of the hearing, morphing it from a noble pursuit of objective truth into a bitter, partisan confrontation regarding procedural legitimacy. The second that strategic shift successfully takes root, the focal point of the room violently twists. The debate is no longer about whether these dark ties actually exist, but rather about whether a representative even possesses the acceptable right to ask questions about them in the first place. This creates an incredibly dangerous inversion of justice. It miraculously lifts the heavy burden of proof entirely off the shoulders of the powerful subjects under investigation and severely drops it onto the person who dared to ask the vital question. Becca Balint, however, firmly refuses to swallow that inversion. She actively yanks the focus back to the core issue, doing so repeatedly, with intense insistence, and with a nearly methodical rhythm. Balint firmly reiterates that she is not posing trick questions. Her deliberate repetition operates as a conscious, calculated tool. In a hostile room where raw authority is actively being weaponized to deflect oversight, repetition transforms into an unyielding act of democratic resistance. It firmly anchors the entire dialogue back to the original transgression, flatly refusing to allow the vital conversation to drift off into the murky waters of irrelevance. Then arrives the singular moment that absolutely defines this intense congressional exchange. Balint sharply asks whether the sitting president was fully aware of Howard Lutnick's documented ties to the Epstein network at the exact moment he finalized the monumental cabinet appointment. This is a breathtakingly direct question, inextricably tied to a very specific executive decision, and deeply grounded in verified, documented chronological timeline. Predictably, the room is met with yet another non-answer. In place of a substantive response, the air is filled with loud interruptions, desperate deflections, and a frantic, clawing attempt by the defense to reclaim total procedural dominance. Representative Balint sharply announces that she is reclaiming her time. That seemingly standard parliamentary phrase actually carries profoundly more weight than it initially appears. Within this specific context, time is not simply a mundane allocation of minutes on a clock. Time is the raw currency of accountability. Every single ticking second that is deliberately wasted avoiding the fundamental question is another second where the undeniable truth remains suppressed. Every unspoken answer significantly feeds into a massive, looming pattern of avoidance that is rapidly becoming utterly impossible for the American public to ignore. Pay close attention to how the physical room reacts in this exact moment, because this is the precise threshold where the underlying power dynamics shift far beyond the mere spoken words. Suddenly, the overall tone in the room fundamentally shifts. The frequency of aggressive interruptions rapidly increases, and the core focus of the conversation deliberately begins to scatter in a dozen different directions. What initially launched as a highly targeted, surgical inquiry into specific, documented ties rapidly devolves into a desperate, broad-stroke attempt to redirect the entire narrative. Random references to entirely unrelated political figures, disconnected congressional votes, and historically unrelated controversies are suddenly thrown into the mix, yet absolutely none of these topics actually address the original, pressing question. This conversational chaos is far from random. It is a highly calculated, strategic deployment of noise. Whenever hard evidence becomes far too dense and concentrated for comfort, the only viable escape route for the defense is to artificially expand the conversational frame. They must introduce chaotic noise, fabricate immediate distractions, and violently wrench the audience's attention far away from the undeniable point of institutional pressure. That is the exact psychological mechanism at play when the intense discussion is suddenly and jarringly dragged toward figures like Bill Clinton and Joe Biden. These names are not injected into the record because they hold any factual relevance to the incredibly specific question regarding Howard Lutnick. They are deployed solely because they forcefully construct a convenient, alternative partisan narrative. But there is a glaring, insurmountable problem with utilizing that specific deflection strategy. Dropping other names does absolutely nothing to erase the deeply troubling original timeline of events. It fundamentally does not alter the undeniable historical fact that Jeffrey Epstein was formally convicted as a sexual predator in the year 2008. It completely fails to change the shocking reality that Howard Lutnick physically visited that notorious private island in the year 2012. Furthermore, it does absolutely nothing to negate the astonishing fact that, years after that visit, Howard Lutnick was comfortably elevated to a prestigious cabinet-level government position without any confirmed, rigorous scrutiny originating from the Department of Justice. These damning facts remain entirely fixed in place, completely regardless of how frantically the surrounding conversation desperately shifts and pivots around them. That immutable reality is exactly why this specific congressional hearing matters so profoundly. It matters not merely as a dramatic piece of shallow political spectacle, but rather as an incredibly vital diagnostic event for the health of the Republic. It mercilessly exposes not just what the powerful system loudly proclaims it does in its press releases, but how it actually behaves when it is cornered by highly inconvenient, undeniable evidence. It vividly maps out exactly where the crucial lines of legal accountability hold firm, and exactly where they pathetically begin to dissolve into nothingness. And as we watch the footage, we are witnessing those critical lines dissolving in real time before our very eyes. Once those ethical lines begin to inevitably break down, the subsequent phase of institutional failure becomes highly predictable. Bureaucratic systems operating under immense, unbearable pressure rarely simply collapse in a quiet heap. Instead, they loudly reveal exactly how they consciously choose to fail. They do not fail through immediate structural disintegration, but through a calculated process of malicious substitution. They masterfully replace direct, honest answers with chaotic procedural noise, and they seamlessly swap out genuine accountability for hollow, theatrical performance. This phenomenon is demonstrated perfectly the very second Representative Balint formally introduces the next heavy layer of physical evidence into the official congressional record. Suddenly, the harsh spotlight is no longer focused solely on whether the Department of Justice bothered to ask questions, but rather on the terrifying reality of what the Department of Justice already possessed in its own filing cabinets. This is the precise moment where the specific term unredacted becomes utterly impossible for the defense to casually brush aside. According to the meticulously sourced documents explicitly referenced during this tense exchange, these are not heavily censored partial files, vague executive summaries, or unreliable second-hand hearsay reports. They are complete, unredacted, foundational records fundamentally tied directly to Jeffrey Epstein's vast illicit network. These vital documents span across multiple years, traverse numerous legal jurisdictions, and detail complex, opaque financial channels. They are thoroughly packed with specific names, explicit travel logs, and verified associations that had already been quietly authenticated by internal investigators long before they were ever presented in that committee room. Therefore, when Representative Balint actively weaponizes these specific files, she is absolutely not engaging in wild, baseless speculation. She is methodically placing officially certified, verified material squarely into a massive public forum. The absolute bare minimum expectation in that specific moment is not further vague interpretation, but direct, unyielding confirmation. Astonishingly, instead of providing that desperately needed confirmation, Pam Bondi rapidly contorts into an entirely different defensive posture. She does not become defensive in the standard, expected manner, but instead becomes highly evasive in her core linguistic structure. She desperately shifts the entire weight of the conversation away from the damning contents of the physical files and directly attacks the specific framing of Balint's questions. This is an incredibly critical analytical distinction to make. When the raw, underlying substance of an allegation simply cannot be logically or factually challenged, the absolute final desperate option remaining is to aggressively attack the surrounding context. This is precisely why the dialogue begins to lazily drift toward complaints about proper tone, congressional decorum, and literally anything else that completely ignores the glaring reality of the physical documents sitting right there on the desk. It is a highly controlled, weaponized redirection purposefully engineered to rapidly dilute the overwhelming concentration of the presented evidence. Watch incredibly closely at how Becca Balint brilliantly responds to this tactic, because this is where the verbal exchange morphs into absolute procedural warfare. Balint flatly refuses to take the bait or follow the desperate diversion. She aggressively tightens the conversational scope yet again, ruthlessly dragging the dialogue back to the exact same core demand. She demands a simple yes or no regarding whether the Department of Justice has formally spoken to these powerful individuals regarding their verified Epstein tie. She does not ask for a lengthy speech, a vague policy clarification, or a generalized statement of intent. She demands a completely binary answer. The true psychological pressure lies entirely within that stark simplicity, because strictly binary questions completely obliterate any available breathing room for political maneuvering. However, Pam Bondi absolutely refuses to enter into that restrictive binary construct. Instead, she intentionally injects dense fogs of ambiguity into a situation where absolutely none is required. She continuously references what the implicated individuals have already conveniently stated in their own public PR maneuvers. This is precisely the critical juncture where the fundamental logic of her defense begins to measurably shatter. Public statements pushed out by crisis PR teams are unequivocally not equivalent to rigorous investigative actions, and deliberately conflating the two is not a minor slip of the tongue or an innocent oversight. It is a highly deliberate act of substitution. It actively replaces the heavy burden of institutional responsibility with the flimsy, self-serving narrative of an individual suspect, and that massive paradigm shift carries disastrous consequences for the concept of justice. Let us break down this dynamic into incredibly concrete, undeniable terms, because this is exactly where the relentless stacking of evidence becomes entirely unavoidable. A public statement is something entirely controlled by the very subject who is under suspicion. It is carefully framed by the subject and heavily limited by the subject's own desire for self-preservation. An official law enforcement investigation, on the other hand, is completely controlled by an authoritative institution, rigorously verified by independent actors, and meticulously documented under the solemn threat of perjury. These two concepts are completely distinct and inherently unequal processes, and actively treating them as completely interchangeable is far from a harmless, neutral act. It effectively castrates the investigating institution, entirely removing it from its rightful role of oversight and obediently handing all the power directly back to the very individual who is supposed to be facing scrutiny. That horrific dynamic is exactly what Becca Balint is masterfully exposing in real time. She achieves this not by throwing wild, baseless accusations or relying on frantic speculation, but by relentlessly forcing this crucial distinction out into the unforgiving open air. When Balint continuously repeats her specific inquiry, she is no longer merely hunting for new, undiscovered pieces of information. She is actively running a real-time stress test to see whether the powerful system is even capable of acknowledging its own written standards of conduct. The resulting answer, or rather the glaring, terrifying lack of one, instantly becomes the ultimate data point that firmly defines the entire outcome of the hearing. Because if the mighty Department of Justice has truly failed to conduct those incredibly basic inquiries, then the fundamental standard of the law is quite simply not being equally applied. As the heated exchange aggressively escalates, the overall tone in the room undergoes yet another significant shift. But this time, the transformation is entirely lacking in subtlety. Pam Bondi begins to broadcast highly visible, unmistakable frustration. This frustration is not directed at the underlying horrific facts of the Epstein case, but rather at the stubborn, unyielding persistence of Balint's questioning. That specific emotional reaction is incredibly important to analyze because it acts as a glaring signal that the intense pressure applied to the defense is no longer merely theoretical. The situation is clearly no longer just an exercise in casually managing a difficult political narrative. It has morphed into a frantic, desperate mission to contain an escalating exposure, and the very definition of institutional containment strictly requires severely limiting the free flow of damaging information. This intense dynamic is precisely the birthplace of the phrase "this is pathetic" rapidly entering the official congressional record. That phrase accomplishes vastly more than simply expressing momentary emotional irritation. It operates as a calculated attempt to completely redefine the foundational legitimacy of the oversight inquiry itself. By framing the questions as fundamentally inappropriate, it attempts to magically erase the fact that the underlying issues remain glaringly unresolved. Yet, that aggressive reframing tactic utterly fails to eliminate the dark, underlying substance of the problem. It merely acts to forcefully layer another dense level of aggressive conflict squarely on top of it. At this crucial stage, the primary question morphs yet again. It is no longer solely about whether the Department of Justice properly acted upon the intelligence it possessed. The new question is whether the Department of Justice is even willing to be publicly perceived as attempting to act. That crucial distinction carries massive weight when the actual audience observing the spectacle is not merely the people sitting within the four walls of the hearing room, but the entirety of the permanent public record and the American people at large. Meanwhile, completely insulated from the political theatrics, the stark physical documents remain entirely unchanged. The chronological timeline of events remains absolutely unchanged. The names listed on the flight logs remain entirely unchanged. That is the fundamental, fatal flaw of relying on verbal deflection in an environment overflowing with concrete, documented evidence. Rhetorical games may successfully shift the media perception for a fleeting, temporary moment, but they possess absolutely zero power to magically alter the underlying historical data. At this exact juncture, the congressional hearing forcefully crashes into a critical threshold. The intense focus begins to aggressively narrow, violently circling around one highly specific, deeply troubling event. That event is the highly documented 2012 trip to Epstein's infamous island, specifically undertaken by Howard Lutnick. This cannot be easily brushed away as some vague, distant association. It is a highly discrete, recorded occurrence inextricably tied to a notorious known location. Furthermore, it took place at a highly specific point in time when Epstein's dark status as a convicted predator was already fully established public knowledge. When that specific 2012 island visit is placed side by side with the official 2008 criminal conviction, the resulting timeline transforms into something utterly impossible for any rational mind to simply ignore. The chronology is fundamentally devoid of any ambiguity whatsoever. It is a pure, undeniable sequence, and relentless sequences are the exact mechanisms that forcefully create inescapable accountability. Consequently, the core question heavily evolves, and Representative Becca Balint brilliantly adjusts her approach accordingly. She presses further. If the formidable Department of Justice completely failed to ask about the broader, generalized ties, did it at the absolute bare minimum bother to examine the details of that specific island trip? Balint does not frame this hypothetically or indirectly. She demands to know, with absolute specificity, whether that singular event has been formally reviewed, properly documented, or rigorously questioned by federal authorities. And once again, an actual, substantive answer entirely fails to arrive. Instead, the trajectory of the conversation violently shifts yet again. The focal point is artificially widened by the defense, and the immense gravity of the moment begins to severely fragment into smaller, chaotic pieces. However, it is vital to understand that intentional fragmentation is absolutely not a form of resolution. It is merely a calculated tactic of delay, and in any robust legal system expressly designed to swiftly respond to glaring evidence, the act of delay carries its own incredibly damning implications. Every single agonizing moment that pointlessly passes without decisive action is an irrefutable moment in which the baseline standard of justice is actively being ignored. And when a legal standard is not applied with absolute, unflinching consistency across the board, it fundamentally ceases to function as a valid standard in any capacity whatsoever. This is the exact moment we plunge headfirst into what can only be accurately described as an act of massive narrative substitution. Desperate references to various other high-profile political figures are suddenly dragged into the fray, not because they are genuinely part of the established chain of evidence, but merely to serve as distracting, parallel examples. The prominent names of Bill Clinton and Joe Biden are aggressively injected into the heated discussion. They are not introduced because they possess any actual relevance to the incredibly specific question regarding Howard Lutnick's vetting. They are paraded out simply because they effectively provide a highly convenient, alternative partisan framework to hide behind. This is a classic, textbook tactic of rhetorical redistribution. Its sole purpose is to forcefully shift the heavy burden away from an incredibly focused, surgical inquiry and lazily dump it into the murky swamp of a generalized, never-ending political debate. While this maneuver can certainly prove effective in muddying the rhetorical waters, it utterly fails to address the glaring original issue staring everyone in the face. Because the original, horrifying issue is still sitting right there on the investigative table. We are still staring at three highly placed senior government officials, undeniable documented ties to a convicted predator, absolutely zero confirmed investigative inquiries orchestrated by the Department of Justice, and an incredibly damning chronological timeline that aligns those grim facts in a manner that absolutely screams for a comprehensive explanation. Representative Balint flatly refuses to take the bait and engage with the transparent diversion. Instead, she immediately returns the laser focus to the central, undeniable point. By doing so, she powerfully reinforces the entire structural integrity of her underlying argument. She makes it glaringly, unmistakably clear that this interrogation has absolutely nothing to do with trivial party affiliations. This is purely and fundamentally about establishing baseline institutional accountability. That specific analytical framing is absolutely critical because it completely violently strips away the comfortable safety blanket of standard partisan defense strategies. It forces the ugly issue directly back into the cold, unforgiving domain of strict institutional responsibility. Simultaneously, the heavy moral dimension of the proceeding rapidly begins to massively intensify. The urgent conversation is no longer strictly confined to dry legal documents and bureaucratic procedures. It dramatically expands to encompass the actual, living human beings profoundly traumatized by the catastrophic failures of that exact same system. It brings into focus the countless survivors of abuse who have agonizingly waited in the shadows not for empty PR statements and not for hollow, bureaucratic explanations, but for genuine, concrete action. In that devastating context, every single calculated deflection from the witness stand takes on massive, crushing additional weight. Because while this tense, verbal exchange plays out in real time under the bright committee room lights, the terrifying real-world consequences extend drastically far beyond those four walls. Those consequences bleed directly into the countless criminal cases that were mysteriously never aggressively pursued. They seep into the vital investigations that were inexplicably never formally opened, and into the crucial, obvious questions that were tragically never asked by the authorities. This is the precise juncture where the deeply troubling concept of a deeply entrenched two-tiered justice system definitively stops being a mere abstract political theory. It becomes undeniably, horrifyingly visible in the stark, glaring contrast between exactly who gets aggressively questioned by federal authorities and who is allowed to simply walk free. At this moment, the high-stakes hearing rapidly reaches yet another critical inflection point. Importantly, this breaking point is not driven by the sudden introduction of brand-new, shocking evidence, but rather by the sheer, crushing weight of accumulated, unanswered pressure. The DOJ's repeated, agonizing inability to simply confirm incredibly basic, fundamental investigative steps violently creates a pattern that is completely impossible to dismiss as a mere innocent coincidence. It strongly suggests something far more sinister than a simple bureaucratic oversight. It heavily points to the existence of an invisible boundary, a thick, unspoken line drawn in the sand that the powerful justice system is completely unwilling to cross under any circumstances. Accurately identifying and exposing that invisible boundary is absolutely essential to fundamentally understanding exactly how the gears of this massive system truly operate in the dark. Because massive, well-funded institutional systems absolutely do not fail in a random, chaotic manner. They fail along highly predictable, established fault lines that are carefully shaped by hidden incentives, unspoken constraints, and massive, entrenched power structures. And when those specific fault lines perfectly align with individuals occupying high positions of supreme authority, the terrifying implications become crystal clear for all to see. The core issue is no longer a question of whether the formidable justice system actually possesses the capability to act. The issue is whether it actively, consciously, chooses to act when dealing with certain protected individuals. And that singular dark choice fundamentally defines every single thing that happens afterward. At this advanced stage, the congressional hearing has long ceased to be a simple exercise in attempting to extract direct answers from a recalcitrant witness. It has morphed into a rigorous exercise of thoroughly documenting the absolute absence of those answers. Every single frustrating repetition of the question, every single calculated verbal deflection, and every single glaringly unanswered query actively becomes a permanent part of the official historical record. And unlike fleeting public relations statements that fade into the ether, official congressional records do not simply disappear overnight. They steadily accumulate over time. They stubbornly persist in the archives, and eventually, they violently demand a massive, painful societal reconciliation. That precarious tipping point is exactly where we find ourselves standing right now. We are currently situated precisely at the tipping point where the sheer, suffocating accumulation of damning evidence finally begins to completely outweigh the tactical effectiveness of political deflection. We have reached the explosive intersection where the undeniable chronological timeline, the verified, unredacted documents, and the deafeningly unanswered questions forcefully converge into one single, utterly unavoidable conclusion. This profound conclusion is not something being explicitly stated out loud by the witness, nor is it being directly confirmed by the authorities. Instead, it is being meticulously and undeniably constructed through the sheer, gaping absence of truth itself. That incredibly dark conclusion is precisely what will violently propel this historic hearing into its highly anticipated next phase. And that upcoming next phase is exactly where the fragile institutional structure definitively stops, simply bending under the immense pressure, and finally starts clearly revealing exactly what it was always quietly designed to protect in the first place. Because the second that the glaring absence of answers officially transforms into the primary piece of evidence itself, the focal question drastically changes. The question is no longer merely about the frustrating political theater that just happened inside that specific hearing room. The terrifying question suddenly becomes about the devastating reality of what happens completely outside of it. It becomes about the massive, well-funded enforcement systems that were supposedly explicitly mandated to aggressively act long before this congressional hearing ever even took place. That is the exact moment where the heavily debated phrase two-tiered system entirely stops functioning as catchy political rhetoric and officially starts functioning as a cold, measurable, terrifying reality. We are not witnessing this failure in abstract theory, nor in biased partisan opinion, but in fully observable, documented bureaucratic behavior while under direct, intense congressional questioning. Let us aggressively return our focus to the specific sequence of events, because this is the exact juncture where the applied pressure truly becomes entirely undeniable. Representative Becca Balint is no longer desperately trying to introduce brand new, unvetted names into the chaotic fray. Instead, she is actively, relentlessly reinforcing the incredibly solid, already existing public record. She lists them clearly: Howard Lutnick, John Phelan, Stephen Feinberg. Every single one of these immensely powerful men is inextricably tied, through heavily documented and verified associations, to the dark network of Jeffrey Epstein. Every single one of them currently occupies an incredibly sensitive government position that strictly demands the absolute highest conceivable level of unwavering public trust. And absolutely none of them can be definitively confirmed as having ever been officially questioned by the Department of Justice operating directly under Pam Bondi's supreme authority. We must be incredibly clear that glaring omission is absolutely not a minor bureaucratic gap. That is a massive, blindingly obvious behavioral pattern. And when specific behavioral patterns begin to repeat themselves consistently across various powerful individuals and entire government departments, they can no longer be dismissed as merely incidental or accidental. They clearly become structural realities. They accurately reflect not just random, isolated decisions, but the deeply held core priorities of the institution itself. And institutional priorities always flawlessly reveal exactly what a powerful system is actively willing to confront, and exactly what it is incredibly determined to avoid at all costs. Watch incredibly closely at how the internal logic of the interrogation drastically tightens right here, because this is precisely where the relentless prosecutorial mode completely takes over the entire proceeding. If Epstein's massive illicit network is genuinely operating as it has been widely described as a deeply entrenched, multi-decade, vast international conspiracy involving massive financial crimes, horrific human trafficking, and rampant abuse, then absolutely every single verified connection instantly becomes highly relevant. Pursuing these leads is not optional. It is not simply contextual, but it is absolutely, fundamentally necessary for the execution of a complete, competent investigation. Furthermore, when those specific dark connections lead directly straight to currently sitting, high-ranking government officials, the profound obligation of the authorities to investigate does not miraculously decrease, it exponentially increases. Therefore, the shocking absence of any formal inquiry into these men is absolutely not a neutral, harmless state of affairs. It represents a massive, glaring deviation from standard, expected law enforcement procedure. Within any standard, competent investigative framework, discovering a documented association with a known criminal network automatically triggers mandatory follow-up actions. That essential follow-up action subsequently triggers formal, recorded interviews. Those official interviews then generate a permanent paper trail of records, and those exact records firmly establish necessary institutional accountability. However, in this highly specific, deeply troubling case, that essential chain of justice violently breaks right at the very first crucial step. There is absolutely no confirmed formal inquiry, there is no confirmed official interview, and there is certainly no confirmed permanent record. And without those absolute foundational steps, the massive justice system does not merely casually slow down, it grinds to an absolute, screeching halt. Now seriously consider exactly what that terrifying reality means in practical real-world terms. Because this discussion is no longer merely about abstract, boring policy failures debated by academics. This is about highly impactful, calculated operational decisions made by powerful people. It is about deliberate, conscious decisions to aggressively pursue or intentionally not pursue, decisions to rigorously question or conveniently not question, decisions to meticulously document facts or purposely leave them completely undocumented. And every single one of those deliberate, calculated decisions leaves a distinct trail, even when the official written record desperately attempts to remain completely silent. This is the exact dark space where the deeply controversial concept of selective enforcement suddenly becomes entirely, undeniably visible, without the concept ever needing to be explicitly stated out loud. Because true law enforcement is absolutely not defined by the flowery words written in dusty policy manuals. It is solely defined by the concrete actions that are actually physically taken by the authorities. And when incredibly similar criminal cases inexplicably produce wildly different responses from the authorities, that massive discrepancy itself becomes the glaring evidence. It is not merely a bad intent, but undeniable evidence of a heavily skewed, corrupt outcome. Now, firmly layer that cold reality against the crushing moral dimension that has been steadily building like a massive storm throughout this entire heated exchange. As the devastating statistic repeats, a child is subjected to horrific sexual abuse every single 9 minutes within the borders of the United States. According to the solemn declarations of the Department of Justice itself, that terrifying statistic is definitely not just some minor background detail easily swept under the rug. It acts as the very core justification for the entire system's vast existence and immense funding. It definitively outlines exactly why incredibly intrusive investigations are actively initiated in the first place. It dictates exactly why massive amounts of taxpayer resources are heavily allocated. It establishes why such immense, terrifying authority is legally granted to the government. Consequently, when that exact same immensely powerful system suddenly hesitates and cowers in the face of heavily documented connections involving incredibly wealthy, powerful individuals, the resulting stark contrast becomes utterly impossible to unsee or ignore. It becomes painfully obvious because the strict, unyielding standard normally ruthlessly applied to ordinary, everyday cases seemingly completely dissolves into thin air the second those specific cases intersect with individuals holding massive authority. And that terrifying dissolution is absolutely not just a hypothetical theory. It is fully, tragically visible in the massive pile of unanswered questions, in the incredibly glaring missing confirmations, and in the deafening, suffocating silence that entirely fills the empty gaps where accountability should rightfully be. We have now firmly arrived at the exact breaking point where the officially sanctioned narrative can no longer possibly sustain itself without collapsing under the immense weight of its own massive contradictions. Pam Bondi stubbornly continues to heavily emphasize the department's supposed unwavering commitment to blind justice, to total accountability, and to complete transparency. However, those lofty, rehearsed public statements are now standing in direct, violent contrast to the actual, physical record that has just been brutally established right there in that very room. We are staring at a heavily documented record overflowing with highly specific questions forcefully asked and deliberately left unanswered, alongside massive piles of concrete evidence clearly presented and completely unengaged with. And when those two drastically opposing realities violently collide head-on, the inevitable result is absolutely not minor ambiguity. The result is massive, structural dissonance. It is a massive, gaping, highly visible canyon, separating exactly what is loudly claimed from exactly what is actually physically demonstrated. And that massive, dark gap is the exact place where public trust rapidly begins to violently erode and crumble. Let us abruptly yank this entire conversation directly back to the specific details of that infamous 2012 trip, because this is precisely where the mountain of evidence becomes incredibly, undeniably concrete once again. Howard Lutnick's verified, documented presence on Jeffrey Epstein's private island, occurring well after the massive 2008 criminal conviction, is absolutely not a matter of subjective interpretation. It is a verified, fully documented historical event prominently referenced within the internal investigative files. And when that horrific event is placed into its proper chronological sequence, it instantly generates a glaring question that absolutely does not require an ounce of wild speculation. What exactly did Howard Lutnick see while he was there? Who exactly did Howard Lutnick meet with while he was there? And why on earth has the Department of Justice completely failed to officially confirm that those incredibly basic questions were ever actually asked? These are fundamentally not incredibly complex, difficult legal questions. They are the absolute foundational bedrock. They represent the incredibly obvious, mandatory starting point for any genuinely serious, competent law enforcement inquiry into a massive illicit network of this sheer scale. And yet, astonishingly, in this highly specific case, even that incredibly basic, fundamental starting point appears to have been entirely and deliberately bypassed by the authorities. Now, watch incredibly closely as the defensive strategy within the hearing desperately attempts to somehow absorb that immense, crushing pressure, because this is exactly where the internal defensive mechanisms of the system become overwhelmingly visible. The conversation within the room is continuously, forcefully expanded outward by the defense. They frantically continue introducing wildly unrelated topics, entirely unrelated political figures, and historically unrelated controversies. These things are absolutely not introduced as valid evidence, but entirely as a weaponized form of distraction. And when intentional distraction is endlessly repeated, it ceases to be a mere tactic and fully morphs into a comprehensive strategy. However, even the most aggressive strategy has its absolute limits, especially when the underlying hard historical data remains completely and stubbornly fixed in place. Because no matter how many desperate, massive, additional false narratives are aggressively introduced into the room, the original, horrifying timeline of events simply does not change one bit. We still have the 2008 criminal conviction. We still have the highly disturbing 2012 island visit. And we still have the shocking subsequent appointment to a massively powerful cabinet-level position within the government. All of this occurred with absolutely no confirmed, formal inquiry conducted by the Department of Justice. That specific sequence of events is completely, undeniably stable, and incredible stability, especially within the context of massive, swirling contradiction, instantly transforms into immense, crushing pressure. It forcefully corners the powerful system, forcing it to either miraculously reconcile the massive inconsistency or actively continue to stubbornly ignore it. And continued, stubborn avoidance only aggressively amplifies the massive, glaring discrepancy for all the world to see. Now, we inevitably plunge directly into what can only be accurately described as the absolute moral inflection point of the entire congressional hearing. Because at this advanced, late stage of the proceeding, the intense discussion is no longer strictly confined to analyzing abstract institutional behavior. The immense ramifications forcefully extend outward to the actual living human beings, profoundly traumatized and affected by that exact catastrophic behavior. We are talking about the countless survivors of horrific abuse who have agonizingly waited in the darkness. They have not been waiting for convenient political alignment or clever, slick narrative framing. They have been desperately waiting for basic, fundamental acknowledgement. And genuine acknowledgement strictly demands real, concrete action. Not empty PR statements, not hollow, meaningless assurances, but measurable, verifiable investigative steps. They are waiting for aggressive, formal interviews to be thoroughly conducted, detailed, permanent records to be meticulously created, and hard, uncomfortable questions to be relentlessly asked under the strict threat of perjury. When those incredibly basic, fundamental investigative steps simply do not magically occur, the resulting absence is completely far from procedural. It is incredibly, devastatingly personal. It directly affects real living people. It fundamentally alters real, sensitive criminal cases. It massive changes real, life-altering outcomes. And that is precisely where this specific congressional hearing completely stops being a dry, boring policy discussion and fully morphs into a massive, searing moral evaluation of the system itself. Because the burning question is absolutely no longer whether the powerful system actually possesses the capability to aggressively act. The question is whether it consciously, deliberately chooses to act when the highly protected subjects of the inquiry happen to hold massive amounts of political power. And that specific, dark choice fundamentally defines the true, underlying integrity of the massive system far more accurately than any well-crafted public statement ever possibly could. Now, we must seriously pause to deeply consider the massive, terrifying implications that extend far beyond this single, explosive exchange. Because exactly what is being so clearly documented here today is absolutely not an isolated freak failure. It is an incredibly dangerous, established pattern that can easily be applied to countless other cases, numerous other vital investigations, and countless other critical law enforcement decisions. If the basic, fundamental standard of law is not being strictly applied here, in a case where the horrific evidence is already incredibly well established, then where exactly on earth is it ever actually being applied? And if the law is genuinely being applied this selectively, then the entire noble concept of equal justice for all completely devolves into something utterly conditional. That terrifying reality is the real, bleeding issue sitting right at the very center of this explosive hearing. It is absolutely not about trivial partisan conflict or flashy, rhetorical escalation. It is entirely about fundamental, structural consistency. The question is whether the exact same strict rules aggressively apply to absolutely all individuals, completely regardless of their massive wealth or prominent position, or whether those rigid rules magically shift and bend the second that extreme authority is involved. And the horrifying answer, strictly based heavily on the undeniable public record established so far, is clearly not being explicitly stated out loud. Instead, it is being fully, undeniably demonstrated through sheer absence, through endless verbal deflection, and through the DOJ's repeated, agonizing inability to simply confirm incredibly basic, fundamental investigative actions. We have finally arrived at the exact critical point where the congressional hearing has effectively, completely transformed into its very own massive piece of damning evidence. Because the highly evasive behavior plainly observed right there in that room is clearly no longer functionally separate from the dark issue actively being examined. The evasiveness is literally a core part of it. The witness's behavior perfectly reflects the exact same massive patterns, the exact same skewed priorities, and the exact same invisible boundaries of protection. And that undeniable reality is precisely why this specific explosive moment matters so incredibly much. It does not matter primarily because of the specific words that were spoken, but terrifyingly because of exactly what could absolutely not be said. The power of the moment lies not in the brilliant questions that were asked, but in the incredibly damning answers that somehow never managed to arrive. And in the dead space of that gaping absence, the massive system inadvertently reveals exactly, precisely how it actually operates when it is violently tested under extreme pressure. And when a powerful, entrenched system finally violently reveals its true, ugly nature under pressure, the absolute final question is no longer whether something tragically went wrong in the past. The only question that remains is whether anything whatsoever will actually be corrected now that the rot has been fully, painfully exposed to the light. Because brutal exposure without any tangible consequence is absolutely not genuine accountability. It is simply the grim, public documentation of societal tolerance for corruption. And what you just agonizingly watched was not simply a minor, temporary breakdown of the gears. It was a horrifying live demonstration of exactly how incredibly far the massive legal system can drastically stretch itself without entirely snapping in half. This stretching did not occur because the underlying evidence is incredibly weak, but entirely because the subsequent enforcement is incredibly selective. And rampant selective enforcement is the exact toxic environment where public trust does not simply slowly decline, it violently, catastrophically collapses entirely. Let us aggressively return one more time to the very core center of this absolute mess, because the specific, concrete details matter vastly more than the dramatic, emotional reactions. We have three prominent names permanently entered into the official public record. They are inextricably tied through heavily documented, verified associations directly to the vast network of Jeffrey Epstein, Howard Lutnick, John Phelan, Stephen Feinberg. Each and every one of these men currently holds incredibly sensitive government positions that absolutely demand rigorous, uncompromising oversight at the absolute highest conceivable level. We have a clear, undeniable chronological timeline that firmly places those dark associations well after a massive, highly public criminal conviction, absolutely not before it. And finally, we have a Department of Justice, currently led by Pam Bondi, that simply cannot, or will not, even confirm whether it ever bothered to ask the incredibly basic, first fundamental question. That horrific reality is the absolute baseline. This is not wild interpretation, and it is definitely not dramatic exaggeration. It is just the cold, hard, baseline reality of the situation. And once that terrifying baseline is firmly established, absolutely everything that follows it essentially becomes a massive matter of institutional consistency, because the rule of law, if it is to actually function as a valid law, must rigidly operate in the exact same manner completely regardless of exactly who is involved. Otherwise, it is fundamentally not the law. It is simply raw, unchecked discretion poorly disguised as noble principle. Now, take a moment to seriously consider exactly how this scenario would predictably unfold in literally any other standard context. Imagine an ordinary individual possessing highly documented ties to a notorious convicted predator, directly connected through verified travel records, and appearing heavily in official investigative files. That ordinary individual would be aggressively questioned. That ordinary individual would be vigorously interviewed by authorities. That ordinary individual would absolutely be a central part of a heavily documented, rigorous legal process expressly designed to definitively establish the hard fact. But right here, in this specific room filled with powerful men, that entire rigorous process appears to inexplicably stop completely before it even has a chance to begin. And that terrifying halt is precisely where the dark concept of a two-tiered justice system violently moves from being a mere political accusation to a cold, hard, undeniable observation. Because the fundamental difference is absolutely not found in the quality of the evidence. The terrifying difference is entirely found in the system's wildly skewed response to that exact same evidence. And the actual response is exactly what defines true legal enforcement. Now, we must forcefully bring back the crushing moral dimension once again, because this is precisely where the immense, suffocating weight of the moment simply becomes unavoidable. As the DOJ noted, every single 9 minutes, a child is horrifically subjected to sexual abuse somewhere within the United States. That chilling statistic is absolutely not just an abstract number floating on a page. It is a massive, ticking clock that never, ever stops ticking. It relentlessly measures not just the horrific incidents themselves, but the massive, systemic failures to actually prevent those incidents, the tragic failures to vigorously investigate them, the pathetic failures to aggressively prosecute them, and the catastrophic failures to hold anyone truly accountable. And situated directly within that terrifying context, every single unanswered question echoing in that congressional hearing carries an incredibly massive cost. We are not talking about a temporary political cost or a minor reputational cost, but a devastating, irreparable human cost. Because every single agonizing delay, every single slick verbal deflection, and every single stubborn refusal to genuinely engage with the hard evidence directly contributes to a massive system that fundamentally does not respond equally. And a system rooted in fundamentally unequal response is the exact place where justice definitively stops being justice. Now, we must focus our attention directly on the countless survivors, because this is exactly the critical part that is incredibly easy for powerful politicians to completely overlook while sitting in a room heavily filled with dry procedure and endless bureaucratic jargon. Those survivors are absolutely not watching the screens to judge clever political rhetoric. They are not carefully measuring the tone of the room or the decorum of the speakers. They are desperately, agonizingly waiting for real action. They are waiting for the basic, human acknowledgement that their horrific cases actually matter enough to be aggressively pursued completely without exception. And exactly what they witnessed in that room was the absolute, crushing opposite of action. They saw complete, unadulterated avoidance. They watched a massive system that can beautifully, flawlessly articulate its noble mission statement, yet tragically, hopelessly struggles to actually apply that mission with any semblance of consistency. They watched as basic, fundamental questions that absolutely should have produced clear, undeniable answers slowly dissolve into endless, frustrating exchanges that ultimately produced absolutely nothing of substance. And that massive, gaping absence is precisely what entirely defines their incredibly painful, lifelong experience dealing with this broken system. Pam Bondi had an incredible golden opportunity in that specific, highly publicized moment, not to get incredibly defensive and not to endlessly deflect, but to actually provide absolute clarity. She had the chance to simply say, yes, these incredibly powerful individuals have indeed been contacted by our investigators, or no, they have definitively not been contacted. And then she could have explicitly explained exactly why. Either of those direct answers would have successfully established a firm, undeniable position. But instead, the room was provided with absolutely neither, and residing deeply within that frustrating space of neither, the massive system actively, consciously chose dark ambiguity, completely over genuine accountability. Because weaponized ambiguity flawlessly allows for the illusion of forward movement entirely without the burden of real commitment. It brilliantly allows for the shallow appearance of deep engagement, entirely without ever having to provide the heavy substance of actual, concrete action. Now, we must grimly consider the terrifying, long-term implications of that specific, calculated choice. Because massive bureaucratic systems absolutely do not operate in a total vacuum of isolation. They fundamentally operate via established patterns. And those patterns, once they are firmly established, tend to violently repeat themselves endlessly. If this staggering level of avoidance is the actual response in a case operating with this unprecedented level of massive public visibility, what on earth is the actual response in the countless, quiet cases that never, ever reach a public hearing room? What exactly happens to the crucial evidence that is never forcefully presented on national television, and to the vital, burning questions that are simply never, ever asked? This terrifying reality is exactly where the impact of this specific congressional hearing massively expands far beyond its immediate, narrow context. It instantly becomes a massive, permanent reference point. It establishes a terrifying, immovable benchmark for exactly how incredibly similar situations will undoubtedly be handled moving into the future. And if that new, established benchmark is nothing but deafening silence, then horrific silence officially becomes the new, accepted standard of the land. Now we finally arrive at the absolute deepest final layer, the one specific layer that quietly sits directly beneath all the others: public trust. We are not talking about shallow political trust or blind, partisan institutional loyalty, but rather the basic, fundamental confidence that the justice system actually functions as it was originally intended. The unwavering belief that when solid evidence is presented, it is actually rigorously examined. The belief that when difficult questions are asked, they are actually, honestly answered. Because without that core foundational belief, the entire massive structure of society becomes incredibly, dangerously unstable. This terrifying collapse does not happen visibly at first, nor does it happen immediately, but rather it happens gradually, quietly, as every single unanswered question slowly accumulates. It happens as every single massive inconsistency violently compounds upon itself, until the towering system no longer even needs to be actively challenged by outside forces, simply because it has already successfully undermined and destroyed itself entirely from within. And that incredibly dark, sobering reality is exactly where this whole ordeal leaves us standing today. We are left holding a massive public record, not of what was successfully proven, but of exactly what was desperately avoided. We are left staring at a sequence, not of brave actions taken, but of vital actions permanently deferred. We are left with a massive justice system not physically collapsing, but rather actively, brazenly revealing the exact, specific conditions under which it actively chooses not to act. So the ultimate question is absolutely no longer strictly about Pam Bondi. It is absolutely no longer strictly about Becca Balint. It is entirely about whether the rigid rules that harshly govern absolutely everyone else genuinely apply at the absolute highest, most elite levels of power, or whether those supposedly rigid rules magically shift when their strict enforcement suddenly becomes politically inconvenient. Because if they do indeed shift, then the system is fundamentally not broken at all. It is actually functioning exactly, flawlessly, as it was designed to function, and that specific, corrupt design is exactly what desperately needs to be aggressively examined next. So, I implore you to ask yourself this one burning question. If the immense, powerful Department of Justice simply cannot even confirm that it has asked the most basic, fundamental questions regarding highly documented ties to one of the most utterly infamous, prolific criminal networks in all of modern history, what else exactly has it quietly chosen not to ask? What other horrors has it actively, consciously chosen not to see? And exactly what does that terrifying prospect mean for every single criminal case that desperately depends entirely on the absolute equal enforcement of the law? Drop your thoughts and opinions below. Do you genuinely believe that Pam Bondi is nobly protecting the justice system, or is she actively protecting the incredibly powerful people hiding inside of it? Should absolutely every single government official prominently named in those unredacted files be immediately, formally investigated under oath? And if your answer is an absolute yes, why on earth hasn't it already happened? Like this video right now if you firmly believe that legal accountability should absolutely not heavily depend on an individual's elite status. Share it widely with someone who perhaps still naively thinks the justice system actually applies equally to absolutely everyone. And make sure to subscribe, because we are absolutely going to keep relentlessly following this dark paper trail until every single agonizingly unanswered question is forcefully dragged into the light.